So I have a highly intellectual and theological way of beginning my sermon this morning. The Nose Book. Pretend you're snuggled up in bed and you're getting your bedtime story. Everybody grows a nose. I see a nose on every face. I see a nose in every place. A nose between each pair of eyes. Nose, every size. They grow on every kind of head. They come in blue and pink and red. Some are very, very long, case in point. Some are very, very strong. Everywhere a fellow goes, he sees some new kind of nose. A nose is useful, after all. Some play horns and some play ball. A nose is good for making holes in trees, in roofs, in barber poles. But sometimes noses aren't much fun. They sniffle. They get burned by the sun. A nose gets punched and bumped on doors and bumped on walls and bumped on floors. Sometimes your nose will make you sad. Sometimes your nose will make you mad. But just suppose you had no nose. Then you could never smell a rose or pie or chicken a la king. It's a 1970s book. You'll never smell a single thing. And one thing more, suppose no nose. Where would all those glasses sit? They'd all fall off. Just think of it. And that's why everybody grows between his eyes some kind of nose. Thus ends the reading from Dr. Seuss's series, Bright and Early Books for Beginners. I think Al Perkins knew how many people complained, that's the author of the book, Al Perkins, about their noses. Were insecure about their noses. Isn't it interesting that there are 26 pages in this short little book, and only 2 are actually on what a nose is for? Smelling. That's it. And isn't it interesting that smelling, out of all our senses, is one of the strongest things? Aren't I correct that you smell something bad, some things in particular, once in life, and it keeps you away from whatever you smelled for the rest of your life? And you smell something good, a person, a place, a food item, and you may be attached to that someone or something forever. Have you ever thought about the smells of our scripture today? Matthew mentions, actually doesn't mention much about location at all, the version that Debbie read. And Luke has a lot about location and actually gets down to this thing that's called a manger. When you look at the Greek word behind manger, it can have one of 2 meanings. A stall where an animal is actually tied, or it can be a trough, a place that an animal eats out of. But there's actually a possibility that there was no stable, there was no barn, that this stall or this trough might have actually been out in a field with no covering at all, or an open place in the town of Bethlehem, so that Jesus might have been born with no cover. But it definitely leads us to a place where animals were, whether it was inside or outside. A manger. Luke must have thought it was important because he mentioned that the child was wrapped in cloth and lying in a manger 3 times within about 10 verses. He wanted us, for some reason, to focus in on it. Max Lucado is a wonderful author who takes a lot of our biblical narratives and he adds color to them. He writes a lot of short stories, and he has one called The Arrival. And Lucado does envision a barn or a stable. Listen to the images that he gives to this story. God had entered the world as a baby. Yet were someone to chance upon the sheep stable on the outskirts of Bethlehem that morning, what a peculiar scene they would behold. A stable, the stable, stinks like all stables do. The stench of urine, dung, and sheep reeks pungently in the air. The ground is hard, the hay scarce. Cobwebs cling to the ceiling, and a mouse scurries across the dirt floor. A more lowly place of birth could not exist. You can almost smell it if you've ever been in a barn or stable before. And I would even add other things. Maybe the hay is damp and you can smell that hay. Maybe it's cold and Mary and Joseph have created a fire nearby, and so there is the smell of smoke, the warmth of flame. Maybe there's the smell of cooking from homes that are not too far away, and all of these smells have mixed together. It is not a good combination. Yet it is a combination that Mary and Joseph are probably used to and have smelled before. Now, I don't want to be too idealistic, but after the birth of Jesus, I imagine only a couple of smells really mattered. The smell of a newborn child's head nestled right here on Mary, and her nose rested upon that newborn head, taking in the smell of that child that has been wrapped in bands of cloth. And the child's face nestled on the chest of a mother, and taking in the smell of his mother for the first time. But add to this, if you will, even if it is hard to even fathom, that the incarnation actually happened. That God took on flesh so that Mary is smelling for the first time the crown, the head of God. And that God, in the flesh, is experiencing what humans have experienced for the first time. The smell of the chest of a mother. Beautifully human, yet totally of God. Yes, Max Lucado gives us an image of the smell of a stable, of animal waste and everything that you might smell in a barn. But I'd love for a moment to turn that on its head with a quote from another commentator. This author writes, Jesus is born in the city of David, not in lodgings like an alien, but in a manger where God sustains his people. Jesus is born in the city of David, not in lodgings like an alien, but in a manger where God sustains his people. Isn't it a good thing that Jesus wasn't in lodging like somebody who was in a place that they weren't from or didn't belong? But Jesus was born in a manger, a trough, a place where sustenance is normally placed for an animal. The very animals that bring sustenance to the people who own them. That God in the flesh was placed in a place of feeding. The difference is that this child is the food and drink for those of us who never need to hunger and thirst again for the things of our core: grace, love, and hope. No, the perfect place for the Son of God was a manger, a place of sustenance. May we each find glimpse of that sustenance. May we waft in the smell of that newborn and ourselves be born anew this season. Merry Christmas.